Okay, this will be a video about EPCOT in Disney World, which has just a really fascinating history. Most people probably know EPCOT as this big silver ball, but there's just way more to it than that because Walt Disney originally envisioned EPCOT as an entire city with 20,000 people living in it. Disney was going to build this city from the ground up and just incorporate all this wild technology, all this futuristic stuff into it. And in fact, EPCOT stands for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. And the really interesting thing is that Walt Disney's plans for EPCOT are basically identical to these 15-minute cities that are in the news all the time now, because Disney was going to have all this control over the people who lived in this EPCOT city. It was really like totalitarian type control, like something out of 1984 or something out of the Hunger Games. And I just thought it'd be real interesting to kind of look at these just crazy, wild plans that Walt Disney had for this Epcot city and look at how similar his vision for Epcot is to these 15-minute cities that are in the news all the time now. So, first off, most people are probably familiar with these 15-minute cities that have been everywhere in the news over the past few years. They are a very controversial issue. They're kind of being pitched as these like utopian like communities where you can walk or bike to anything that you need within 15 minutes, your job, the doctor, the supermarket, all that stuff. And everyone will be living together in a really small amount of space. So they're kind of being pitched as these like places that will have these really close knit, very tight knit communities. But there is a ton of opposition to these 15-minute cities, a lot of protests because a lot of people worry that the government will have all this control over the people who live in these cities. And there are literally a million movies about dystopian futures where people are forced into controlled communities like these. They've had all their rights and all their freedoms stripped away. And the main criticism of these 15-minute cities is that they're the first step towards implementing widespread control over people like this. And the World Economic Forum are the ones behind this big push for these 15-minute cities. This is a big forum of just very rich, very powerful people who pretty much just get together and figure out ways to push their agenda onto the rest of society. And there's a lot of people out there who just do not trust anyone involved with the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum put this pretty well-known quote out a couple years ago. They said by 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And a lot of people think that implementing these 15-minute cities is kind of like the first step towards a future where people just don't own things. They're controlled because they're dependent on the government for their housing, for their transportation, for just everything. So there's plenty out there about these 15-minute cities, but this isn't a new concept at all. And what's really interesting is that Epcot was really supposed to be the very first 15-minute city, and this was 60 years ago because Walt Disney's vision for what he wanted Epcot to be was pretty much identical to these 15-minute cities. And it's very interesting how everything that's being discussed right now with the 15-minute cities, this has all been discussed for a very long time. So Walt Disney's vision for Epcot was just totally bonkers. He envisioned it as a city of 20,000 people that would be just super advanced and futuristic. And it all began in the very early 1960s when Walt Disney started buying up just a ton of land in Central Florida. That little dot there might not look like much, but it was about 40 square miles. So it was quite a bit of land. And this land was used to build Disney World, but Disney World only used just a very small fraction of the total land that Walt Disney owned. And he had this massively grand plan for what he was going to do with the rest of the land. And he talked about his plan in this video that he recorded after the purchase. I'll go ahead and play this clip here real quick.
Right now, our plans include an airport of the future down here in Osceola County, an entrance complex where all visitors will enter Disney World, an industrial park area covering about 1,000 acres, and of course, the theme park area way up here. The most exciting, the most important part of our Florida project, in fact, the heart of everything we'll be doing in Disney World, will be our experimental prototype city of tomorrow. We call it EPCOT.
So he was planning on building an airport on this land, and there'd be a number of other attractions too. But as he said in the video, EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, That was gonna be, like, the big project with this land. It absolutely dwarfed Disney World in terms of scope and size, and Disney World really was kinda like almost just an afterthought. It was just like a little side project. Epcot really was supposed to be the big project that Walt Disney was focusing on, and Epcot wasn't gonna be just big, it was gonna be ultra futuristic. A lot of the things that Walt Disney talked about that he was planning on doing in this experimental city of his, they sound futuristic even today. So this Epcot city was going to be built as a big giant circle with a bunch of different areas emanating out from the middle. And right in the middle of the city would be the downtown area with high-rise buildings and offices and apartment buildings, and there'd also be a bunch of shopping and dining. And this entire downtown area would be encased in a dome, meaning that it would never rain, the temperature would never vary within this dome. And then this first area would be surrounded by just a huge green area with parks and trees, just a really massive nature area. And then lastly would come a big area that would just have a whole bunch of suburban type housing like this. And each one of these areas would have their own people mover transport system to take people downtown or to take them to other parts of the city. So most people living in Epcot wouldn't even own a car because everything they needed would be accessible by foot or by public transportation. But Walt Disney was planning on building an underground highway system for delivery trucks and other traffic to keep cars out of sight. So you would hardly ever see any cars within this Epcot city. But the thing that really stands out about Epcot was the control, because Disney was going to institute all this control over the people who lived in the city. No one would own their homes or their land, so all residences would be rented from Disney, and this meant that no one living in Epcot would have municipal voting rights. So you wouldn't vote on the local government or any local issues. So if there was something you disagreed with, there really wasn't much you could do about it, and everyone living in Epcot would also be required to have a job. And the plan was that everyone would either work in Epcot City itself or they would work at Disney World. There would be no small businesses or anything like that. And as I mentioned, the places where people would work would be accessible by either people movers or monorails, so most people wouldn't even own a car. But the main form of control was that Disney would not only own everything, but they would also be the government for the area. So they would self govern and run the area themselves, because this Reedy Creek Development Act was a special law that was passed by the Florida government that basically established an entirely new district that Disney could just run themselves. It was known as the Disney Bill because it was just very rare to just establish an entirely new district that would be run by a private corporation. And in this book right there, Walt Disney and the Quest for Community, it talks about Epcot and refers to Disney as the Vatican City of leisure and entertainment, because Vatican City is also one of the few places in the world that also has these same self governing powers. And this book also talks about how Disney would have the powers to instate local taxes really on whatever they wanted. Things like gasoline taxes on people when they actually did need to drive. So basically, Disney would own everything in this area and they were the government. And you were dependent on them to provide your housing, your employment, your transportation. And it didn't even stop there, because Walt Disney was planning on building a second city in Florida. And maybe most interestingly, he was working on developing a cashless society, which is just crazy because the debate about a cashless society is something else that's in the news a lot now. And again, this was 60 years ago that Walt Disney was making plans for a cashless society. So it really seems like this plan for controlling people has been in place for a long time. These 15-minute cities aren't just some like new idea that came out of nowhere recently. The term 15-minute city is new, but the concept has been around for quite some time. And Walt Disney actually died just a few months after he recorded this video about his vision for Epcot. And after he died, the whole project of creating an experimental city of tomorrow, it just kind of died out as well, because he was the one who was really heading this up and really pushing for this to happen. And even though Epcot died out, the whole concept of what Walt Disney wanted to do with this city is still very much alive, because there are a whole bunch of people who really, really want to make these 15-minute cities happen. I mentioned the World Economic Forum. They're basically obsessed with making these 15-minute cities a reality. Joe Biden had this Build Back Better bill that was just very focused on establishing and funding 15-minute cities. And then before he was elected, Trump said he would build 10 freedom cities, quote unquote, which was basically just a fancy new name for these 15-minute cities. And then there's this city being planned named Telosa, and this is some wild, wild stuff. So this guy, Mark Lore, he's a billionaire. He just bought the Minnesota Timberwolves NBA team with Alex Rodriguez, and he has a plan to build this ultra futuristic city named Telosa. And this Telosa is basically Walt Disney's Epcot City updated for 2025. And so much of what Disney talked about with EPCOT, that's exactly what's being planned for Telosa. And with Telosa, the official reason given for why it's being pushed so hard has to do with the environment. And that's always the reason that's given for why these 15-minute cities need to happen. It's always the environment because they'll have all this sustainable energy and people won't have cars. So that will help solve the problem of global warming or climate change, as it's now called, because a few years ago, global warming was rebranded to climate change because it turns out that the planet wasn't really getting warmer like a lot of people were screaming about. So the name global warming wasn't really that effective. So they just rebranded it to climate change and continued with the same doom and gloom rhetoric. But anyway, Telosa and Epcot and all these 15-minute cities are being pushed in the name of saving the environment. That's always the big reason that's given for why they need to happen, which in theory sounds good. Obviously, no one is opposed to reducing pollution or living greener. But as I mentioned, the controversy is that a lot of people think that's just kind of like a Trojan horse, basically. That the real reason that people want these 15-minute cities to happen is because of control. And the cashless society, which Walt Disney was also working on, this is another form of control. And you can actually see how this cashless society would be used for control in the news today. There's several recent examples of people and organizations just having their funds frozen by digital banks, seemingly for no reason other than someone at the bank disagrees with whatever opinion that person has or disagrees with whatever they're saying. And just a few years ago, there were a bunch of truckers in Canada who were protesting the COVID lockdowns, and people from all over were Venmoing them money, donating on a GoFundMe page to support them. And then those companies just shut down the digital accounts that the truckers were using because they didn't want people to be able to support them. And it's just so easy to disable someone's digital account that really anyone could have their account shut down for any type of reason or any type of thing they're protesting. I mean, it really could happen to anyone very, very easily. So I do think it's interesting that a lot of these grand plans that Walt Disney had 60 years ago are really identical to some of the things that are going on in the news today. Definitely seems like a lot of really powerful people want to make these 15-minute cities a reality in the name of combating climate change. And you can believe that if you want to, but I definitely question whether that's the true reason for them. And then lastly, just wanted to give a big shout out to the members here on YouTube and the supporters on Patreon. Thanks so much for your support. Truly means a lot. I really greatly appreciate it. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.